This is Richard Sanders, editor of Press for Conversion magazine. And I guess press has double meaning here, press for publication and also press for pushing for something.
Pushing for
Right.
something, yes.
So you have written an article which I read with interest, and it's called Canada Syndrome. So maybe you can start telling us a little bit about what is this Canada Syndrome.
Okay, sure. Well, it's part of a bigger publication called Captive Canada,
Mm-hmm.
um, which looks at different ways through Canadian history that people have been held captive, mostly focusing on internment camps.
Mm-hmm.
During the 20th century, there were four different distinct internment camp programs from the First World War, then between the wars, and then the Second World War, and then during the Cold War, there was another internment camp program called Profunk. But what I'm also interested in is how people are held captive by stories, by narratives, by ideologies. And actually, I think it's a much more effective way of holding people captive than putting them behind bars or putting them in a prison cell or putting them behind barbed wire. You can hold people captive, you can control their thoughts and behaviors by
Mm-hmm.
controlling the way they think about themselves and about the world and about their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And the Canada syndrome, by that, it's a kind of a mass psychosis. The Canada syndrome is part of a much broader kind of mass psychosis that has inflicted other societies as well, other settler societies, let's say, like the United States, Australia, South Africa, and Israel are some key examples. So in each of these different countries, they have national ideologies. The people who came to those countries had to have a kind of a ethnocentric and superior view of themselves and of their own culture, because they had to, in each case, kind of impose their culture on the existing or the Aboriginal peoples in those countries, and they this involved in some, in each case, a mass captivity.
Mm-hmm.
So in Canada, for example, let's stick to Canada because this is the area that I studied most recently and most familiar with. We have the reservation system here in Canada, where Aboriginal people were forced to remain on their reservations. So it was a kind of a mass captivity.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had these different internment camp programs. So, um, but in order to get good, ordinary, decent people to not only stand by and allow these things to happen, like the the captivity of others, the enslavement of others, the genocide, in order to get people to go along with it, as well as to participate in it, to be complicit in these crimes,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be able to uh, have a kind of control over those people, over the masses of people, the huge institutions that are involved in making these things happen, because large scale wars and genocide and mass captivity, these are big programs that require lots of people to be involved. So how do you get good, ordinary, decent, well-meaning people to not only stand back and allow this to happen, but to actually take part in it and participate in it and make it happen?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you do that through narratives, through stories, through ideologies, and by controlling those um, cultural ways of captivating people, you can get people to go along and do almost anything because they actually believe that what they're doing is the right thing. It's a good thing. They're helping. So in Canada, we had the residential schools, and the people who did this uh, really believed that they were helping to educate, to civilize, to Christianize the savages and the heathens who were inferior to them.
Can switch now to the current collaboration, Canada's collaboration with war, and the to our traditional celebrations of war, and the more specifically the manufacturing, buying, and selling of weapons.
Hmm. Yeah, well, so we have this prevailing official mythology that Canada is this great nation. We have this mythology that Canada, the great peace-loving country, and we talk about Canadian values of multiculturalism and peace and democracy and human rights and that sort of thing. But this is very far from the truth. In fact, Canada, as you point out, is involved, very involved, in fact, in the manufacturing and export of weapon systems.
Mm-hmm.
So most people don't have any idea about that. We really don't know. Lately, people have been hearing, I think, more and more about this export deal to Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
It's been in the news a lot. But the elephant in the room, the bigger, much larger problem that is still being ignored, even when they talk about the Saudi deal, this one particular export, deal to Saudi Arabia, which is a horrendous thing, and I oppose it. But the much bigger problem is that we have been exporting billions of dollars every year to the United States for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So even during the Vietnam War, when Canada supposedly wasn't involved, we were supplying all sorts of horrible things to the United States, weapon systems and that sort of thing. So Canada's part in the international weapons trade is huge. We're almost always in the top 10 or the top 12 countries in the world in terms of military exports. And we're also very involved, and we have been very involved in US wars and in NATO wars. And this has been the case ever since our beginnings. We've been a part of an imperial system with the Britain or with the United States. So we've been engaged in these colonial imperialist wars, and yet we think we're so perfect and wonderful and utopian.
Because we're collaborating with our ally. We're when Saudi Arabia is not our ally anymore because they're mixing and the issues of Syria, then we notice that we're selling them weapons. But with the United States, we don't notice it because they're our friends.
Yeah, we turn a blind eye to that. We kind of
Yeah,
accept that the United States is our ally, but at the same
yeah.
time, Canadians love to criticize the United States, and many Canadians think the
Mm.
United States is a big warmonger, but they just don't even realize that Canada sells like $4 or $5 billion worth of military equipment to the United States
Yeah.
every year.
So another term you use in your article here of kind of the syndrome is this term peaceable kingdom, and I
Yeah,
guess refers to what you're saying right now that we think that we are a peaceable kingdom.
yeah.
Can you explain a
This,
little more of that?
yeah, sure. This idea of the peaceable kingdom goes way back in Canadian history, and you can find it in many, many hundreds of books and articles going back many decades and generations, in fact, where different scholars and everything from political science to sociology to literary criticism, and popular culture, there's discussion about Canada, the peaceable kingdom. And it goes back to this identity that we have of being part of the British Empire, and yet we were this sort of almost utopian society. We were peaceful, and we were good, honest, decent people, and we have this. We still have the narrative of the Canadian values, and that's carrying on this tradition of the idea of the peaceable kingdom, which is really a myth, because from the very beginning, Canada has been engaged in imperial wars here in here on this continent as well as in other continents. Like from very early on in our history,
So
we've
we,
been doing that.
yeah, so we get caught up into this mythology. We get to believe it, and then you have another term that is called the Stockholm Syndrome,
Yeah,
and maybe to justify our own wrongdoing.
right. So people may have heard of the Stockholm Syndrome. It's a pretty well-known idea. It started in 1973 when there was a bank robbery in Sweden, and some people were held captives by the bank robbers,
Mm-hmm.
and they became came to identify with their captors, and they believed their captors, and they liked their captors, and then they would actually stand up
Where?
for them and defend them
Yeah.
and try to protect them. Even after they had been released, they were supportive of their captors. And so it's an idea of how a small number of people can be kidnapped and held under the control of their sympathies towards their captors. It's called captor bonding, captive bonding now. Um, but right soon after this Stockholm Syndrome, this incident happened, and the Stockholm Syndrome theory was developed. Patty Hearst was kidnapped in the United States, and she she was kidnapped and then herself took part in bank robberies and in kidnapping and in even bomb making, I believe. And she went to jail for that. But she was later pardoned by different U.S. presidents, and her sentence was reduced. And she didn't serve nearly as long as she would have because they talked about her being a victim of the Stockholm Syndrome. I'm saying that the Stockholm Syndrome also exists on a much broader mass level, that we are held captive by our culture and the state and the institutions of the state, like the schools and other institutions, the media. They can control us, and we identify with them, and we actually believe the stories that they tell us.
That's right. So you also talk about rendition, and more specifically, extraordinary rendition. Can you explain a little bit about this
Sure,
term?
yeah. Well, the term extraordinary rendition became well known, I think, around the world with the exposure of information about the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, kidnapping people, grabbing them off the street and taking them away under cover of darkness, and taking them to secret camps where they would be tortured. And this is all part of the war on terror. And different countries were complicit in helping the United States and the CIA to kidnap these suspects. Many of these people innocent, and they were tortured. And of course, when you're tortured, you say anything to be free, to free yourself. You would say anything. Um, the interesting thing about this, I think, is that you contrast extraordinary rendition with what you might call ordinary rendition. So people are held captive in very ordinary ways through bedtime stories, through their myths, through their media articles, and you can capture people and manipulate them. This is another way of controlling them through renditions. You render them captive with stories, because a rendition isn't just to take or to grab or to kidnap someone, but a rendition also means a version of a story. A rendition is just a kind of a narrative. It's a story. It's your account of what's going on, what the story is.
But
So
extraordinary rendition is a little different, or
extraordinary
pardon.
rendition is
Yeah.
when you grab one person or two or three people or a few people or 100 people, like in different places, and you kidnap them. But you can kidnap masses of people, millions of people. You can kidnap them. You can render them captive with your stories, through the media, through by controlling their ideas, their ideologies. And so it's a it's try I'm trying to contrast the individual level with the mass social or cultural level, and also the use of the word rendition in a literal sort of a language sense of language. A rendition is a story or a version of events, versus rendition is also a way of capturing people physically,
Violently.
yeah, violently, yeah.
And you also talk about the hostages, whether they're culpable of what they're wrongdoing. Because if you're brainwashed into believing something, then you do it thinking that you're saving the world, you're bringing democracy to other countries.
hmm
So
hmm
you're captive of this dialogue. So are you responsible for it?
That's a good question. That is a very difficult question. It's the $5 million question,
Mm,
and it you can be. It is possible to be culpable. Often people think that they it's an excuse or justification that gets them off the hook. That they have this narrative, they have this story, so they've been brainwashed. So you may use it as an excuse. Um, for instance, in the publication that I recently have put together, other articles talk about the social gospel, which was a progressive movement here in Canada, the progressive element within the churches that was, in many ways, it was a progressive, forward-thinking movement, but in some ways, um,
Aggressive.
it was very repressive, and they supported the reservations, and they supported residential schools, and they did nothing about internment camps when people were rounded up and pushed into forced labor
Mm.
camps in Canada. So some of the leaders of that movement, for example, J.S. Wordsworth, he's still revered as a great hero within progressive circles. And myself, I was raised by peace activist parents who talked about J.S. Wordsworth as a great hero, and everything they said about the social gospel was positive. And so I was raised to believe that.
Mm.
Now, in doing this research, I've learned a lot of very disturbing truths about J.S. Wordsworth and about the social gospel and about their complicity in residential schools and in other things.
Mm.
So,
Well, he was a minister. Was he a Christian
yeah, he
minister?
was a minister, and he was
Okay.
the first leader of the CCF,
Yeah.
which turned
Mhm.
into the NDP. So within the NDP circles, he's still considered a great hero. So when you talk about J.S. Wordsworth and you criticize him and you say he was a racist, he
He
was a
meant well.
xenophobic,
He
he was a
had a good meaning.
classist.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well he meant well,
Yeah.
but when you say these negative things about heroes like that,
Mm.
progressive heroes,
Mm-hmm.
then people will say, well, you can't judge them
Mm.
because you have to look at them in the context of their times.
Yeah.
At the time, everyone believed those things.
Uh,
That's not true.
so,
Not everyone
oh,
believed those things. The
okay.
Aboriginal people didn't
So
believe those things.
that's right.
He was racist against
Mhm.
blacks and people from the Middle East and Aboriginals and every other group, and he was also a
Chris.
classist.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So it wasn't everyone that believed those things.
Yeah.
Aboriginals didn't believe that they were savage, inferior people. You
Yeah.
know.
But can we say that he was rendered that way because of his culture, his family, his schooling?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So
was he responsible for what he was doing?
the question is, should he have known better? Should he
Yeah.
have known better? Did
Okay.
other people around him in the same
Yeah.
circles as him, did they know? Were there other people at the time that
Mm.
whose
Mm-hmm.
ideas he was exposed to that
Mm-hmm.
did know that that it was wrong? And the answer
Mm.
is yes. There were other people. There were other
Mm.
people. He should have
Okay.
known.
Should have
He
known.
should have known. And it's
Yeah.
not just that he was pulled
Yeah.
along by this movement and that he was pulled along as a part of the movement.
Yeah.
He was a leader of it. He was a creator and a former of these ideas. He pushed people to believe these ideas. He had all sorts of racist,
Yeah.
xenophobic ideas
Yeah.
that he promoted. And he was a leader of that rendition of helping to render others captive by
So
these ideas.
you think that some of these leaders, like Woodwards and Tommy Douglas himself, were actually victims of the Nelsonian knowledge, and maybe you can explain what the Nelsonian knowledge is.
Yeah, this is getting more into the question of whether somebody really, because at some level, at some part of us, do we know that it's wrong and yet we keep doing it?
Mm.
So we have this ideology. Let's say the ideology is that Christianity is the most perfect religion and everyone
Mm.
should become a Christian. And so we should go out and missionize and turn others into Christians.
Convert,
And
save.
those poor Aboriginals, they don't know and they're savages and we need to civilize them.
They needed salvation.
So the question is Nelsonian knowledge. So in Britain, in the legal system in Britain, um, Nelsonian knowledge refers to Admiral Nelson. He was a British admiral a couple hundred years ago, and there is a story of how during a battle at sea, he was supposed to receive a signal, and he was given a signal with flags on another ship, and he knew that that signal was there, and he knew he had a very good reason to believe that the signal would tell him that he should retreat, but he
Mm,
didn't want to retreat. So he
mm.
put his telescope up to his eye, but he was blind in one eye. So he put the telescope up to
Yeah.
his blind eye,
Uh-huh.
and he looked through the telescope. This is the story.
Uh-huh.
Looked through the telescope with his blind eye and said,
I
I don't
don't
see the
see
signal.
anything.
I don't see it.
Yes.
So that means he didn't have to follow the
Yeah.
order.
We see what we want to see. Yeah.
So we see what we want to see. We may have good reason to believe certain thing, but we don't want to see it because it goes against what we want. You know,
Mm.
if we have an
True.
ideology and then sort of facts come our way
Well,
that contradict our
yeah.
our ideology, then we
Yeah.
don't want to see those facts because
That
they're
spoils
disturbing.
the mythology.
Yeah, it
The
spoils.
mythology which is believed by faith, not by fact. But
Yeah.
anyway, let's switch to the international acceptance of the need to protect, the responsibility to protect, and
Mm.
United Nations and many countries like Canada are going along with it. What do you think about this responsibility to protect?
Yeah, it's a United Nations doctrine. Um, it's a major cause of many disputes within the progressive movement. So
Mm,
some people support this idea of the UN doctrine, responsibility to protect, and but the way I see it is that basically the large imperial nations of the world need need excuses or justifications for their wars.
mm,
You can't, the real reasons for wars, in the most part, believe, are economic reasons. Someone is making a lot of money out of these wars, not just by selling the weapons, but by overthrowing governments. You put favorable governments in power that will help businesses to do mining or for deforestation or to exploit people in their factories or
mm,
many other ways that you can make lots of money by waging a war, right? By
mm,
geopolitical maneuvering. You want to put your bases here or there or whatever. Um, so wars have, I think, an economic reason, but you can't tell the public, well, everybody, we need your money and we need you to join our war and to go off and kill people and possibly be killed. We want you to do that because there's a small group of people that are making billions and billions and
mm,
billions of
mm,
dollars,
mm,
and they want to make more money, and they need you to invade that country
mm.
so
People
that they will
wouldn't
make more money. People
people
would
wouldn't
not
go
go
along
along.
with it. Yeah.
No. So you
So,
need an excuse. You need a
mm,
pretext. You need a justification, a rationalization that the
mm,
public will believe, a mythology. You need a
mm,
narrative. You need a
mm,
story that
mm.
will deceive people.
What is wrong with the United Nations trying to protect some people that are being
Well,
genocide?
it sounds like a good idea.
Mm,
I'm not, and I'm not saying that there's never a need to do that. But
mm,
what I'm saying is that there is a great potential to
mm,
exploit this new doctrine of
mm,
responsibility to protect. This UN doctrine of a responsibility to protect is a kind of institutionalization of the process of creating narratives that you can then use to
mm,
convince the public to support a war. It's a creation of a whole new structure that you can then exploit. And so we
mm.
have to be really careful about it
Okay,
and
so
not just support it
yeah, yeah. Right on,
wholesale.
yeah. So, but you're saying a tool is a tool. So, responsibility to protect could be a good tool, but it often can be misused, abused, and used for other purposes than what it was originally created for.
Well, I dispute whether it's originally being created to do good things or whether
Mm,
it's being created. Some people are trying to create it and fix it in stone and
mm,
make this a new kind of law in the United Nations
mm,
for the wrong reasons. Now, I think
mm,
that good, well-meaning peace activists, human rights activists, development activists are going along with it because they really believe it.
mm,
But I think that they are accepting the official narrative about this responsibility to protect without being
mm.
um, dubious enough, without being skeptical enough about the
The reasons
motives
for, yeah,
of
I see.
imperial
Mm,
powers who
okay.
are going to benefit from this.
Yeah. Do you think that people should participate and with their opinion about wars and weapons exports and the right to protect and all this well-meaning, well-intended laws and regulations? Should people actually participate in that through a plebiscite or through a poll?
Oh, I think it's really important for people to get involved and to participate and to try to expose injustice and oppose wars and be active and participate in all kinds of different activities to make the world a better place. I mean, that's really important. Referendums and plebiscites are can be problematic because if people are held captive or rendered captive by a national mythology
Mm,
or some belief that we need to go to war against, because they've told over and over again in the media or something that we need to go to war to do this wonderful protect these people over there, then they may, if they're asked in a referendum, do you think we should go to war against country X? They will say yes, but they may not be very well informed.
yeah.
So to rely on the idea, this is not to say that I trust the politicians to
Mm.
make good judgments either.
But you trust less the
But
general public?
well, I don't know if I trust who I trust more or less.
Mm.
It's a difficult problem.
We were talking before of the hostages. Are they guilty of the myths that
Uh,
are in there? And you said, well, Woodward's is guilty because he should have known better. So Canadians today, are they guilty if they vote on the wrong side of a plebiscite because we should know better? And I think most people do know better now. So should we give that responsibility to people, or should we keep it with the politicians?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think that's a good idea. I like the idea. It certainly is an appealing idea to
Mm.
give the power to people. But I'm just saying,
You,
don't be so sure that you're going to get an answer that you're going to like, because people might
but
be
but
they might.
might shoot their own foot. But I like your point there where you say, well, I don't know whether Canadians are really culpable for their own wrongdoing, looking at back into history of Woodward and Tommy Douglas, because that's where they were, and this is where we are right now. We are brainwashed by the media. So are we responsible for when we go to vote for either political leader or on an issue on referendum? Are we responsible for it?
I think more and more we are responsible because
Mm,
we have access to more information now than we ever had before.
that's right.